Welcome to Rambam In-Depth. Today we'll be discussing the Rambam Hilchos Tumas Ochlin, Perig Vav Halacha Yud Beis. The Rambam says as follows: Kliya shel shum shenoplu mashkin al echad mehen. When there is a braided chain of garlic heads, and liquid falls on one of the heads, hu tameh, it is considered tameh. However, v'chiburei tahar, the parts that are connected to it are not considered tameh; they are tahar. What's the reason? So the Rambam explains, she'ein chiburei adam chibur l'chol davar, because articles joined together by humans, not natural connections, are not considered as joined together for all matters. Now here you could translate it two different ways. The Hebrew says, she'ein chiburei adam chibur l'chol davar, either that it's not considered to be an attachment for anything, for all matters, or it's not for all matters, but it's for some matters. We'll soon see about that. And the Rambam continues, he gives another example, V'chein esrig shenifrash, an esrig that was separated into separate pieces, u'sechavi b'kusha b'kisam, but you skewered it by a weaving needle or a sliver of wood, ein chibur, it's not considered an attachment for the very same reason, because an attachment that was created by humans does not constitute an attachment with regard to the laws of purity and impurity. The Raved criticizes the Rambam, and one of his arguments is that this goes contrary to what the Rambam himself ruled in one halacha before this. In Halacha Yud Aleph, the Rambam says as follows: when one ha'gayzen shektzatsan ba'utzehen k'shein rakin va'amonan kulon k'mei chevel, when one cut off nuts with their stems when they are soft and joined them together like a rope, or joined onions v'chein haptzalim shechibrim b'derech hazayis, if he joined onions like that, they're considered as joint. So here again, here we see the opposite, that even though it's a human-made connection, nevertheless it's considered to be a chibur, it's considered to be an attachment. So what's the difference between that and the example of the esrig? That's the question that the Raved raises, and the Kessef Mishneh addresses and answers the question by showing us that the Rambam is not even talking about Tumah when he talks about the esrig. He's talking about the dinim of Hechsher. What is the meaning of Hechsher? In order for something to become tameh, for food to become tameh, it had to have become moist with liquid. Otherwise, it's not susceptible to impurity. So when the Rambam is talking about the esrig, what does he say over here? He says, "Kliya shel shum shenoplu mashkin alechem and hu tameh v'chiburei tahar." If the liquid fell on one of them, he's not talking about something that's tameh fell on it. Liquid fell on it. He's talking about the law of Hechsher. When it comes to Hechsher, the human attachment is insufficient. It doesn't render it as one. That's when you talk about Hechsher, making it susceptible to impurity. But when you're talking about impurity itself, the attachment does have an effect. What's the logic to distinguish between the two? That's a separate issue, but the Kessef Mishneh seems to suggest that the Rambam is intimating by not mentioning the fact that we're talking about something came in contact with something that's tameh, but rather Hechsher, it became moistened. That has a different status than Tumah. That's the Kessef Mishneh's response. There's a sefer, a commentary on the Mishnah is called Chazon Nachum, and he disagrees with the Kessef Mishneh, and he says there's no difference between whether something becomes susceptible to impurity, Hechsher, or something that becomes tameh itself. That there's no difference between the two, and that hinges on how you translate the words. The Kessef Mishneh translates the words she'ein chibur adam chibur l'chol davar, that attachment of a person is not considered an attachment for all matters. And the Kessef Mishneh interprets that to mean, but for some matters it is. Not for all. Not for Hechsher. But for other matters like Tumah, it does have an effect. Chibur is a chibur. The Chazon Nachum says, no, the Rambam means the opposite. He says it's not considered a chibur l'chol davar for any matter. There's no exceptions to that rule. So the Chazon Nachum answers the question, the contradiction in the words of the Rambam himself as follows. When he talks about onions, they're strung together for them to be preserved for a long time. The intention is to keep that chibur, to keep that attachment indefinitely. that represents a chibur, that represents an attachment, because in all areas of halacha, when something is done in an eifin of kavua, it's established, it's fixed in a pattern to remain that way, that constitutes a real entity, a real it has a status of attachment. On the other hand, when he talks about the esrig, putting it together with a little piece of splint, a piece of wood, it's not done for a long time. That's why it's not considered as a attachment. However, the Nachum raises a question. In the laws of B'tzias Hapas and making Hamotzi, in regard to weekdays and Shabbos, you're supposed to have a whole loaf. The loaf has to be whole. In Shabbos, you need 2 whole loaves. What happens if the loaf is separated into 2? You don't have a whole loaf. So the Shulchan Aruch, which is based on the Rekeach, one of the Rishonim, says there's a solution to that. The solution is, if a person has 2 halves of one loaf, he doesn't have a whole loaf, he can join them together with a piece of wood, or anything, that it shouldn't be visible, and it has the same status as if it was whole. So here we see, and the Shulchan Aruch doesn't register that there's any dissent of this. No one disagrees with this in the way it's presented in the Shulchan Aruch. So then why is it when you're eating challah, you're not eating challah, you're not joining the challah for a long term, you're going to be eating it, making hamotzi, and you're going to be eating it right away. And yet it's considered a chibur. So why is the esrig, where it's joined together not for a long time, why is that not considered a chibur? What's the difference? So according to the Kessef Mishneh, there's no problem, because according to the Kessef Mishneh, it is a chibur for all matters except for the laws of Hechsher. But for hamotzi, just like for the laws of Tumah v'Tara, it's not a problem. So the Nachum gives the following answer. He says, when something is be'etzem, one body, like an esrig, it's a naturally one body, it's not made up of different parts. If it becomes separated, you can't restore it to its original state of being whole through the efforts of a person. It's not natural. The natural state of it is to be whole, and now you broke that natural state. You can't restore it unless you can't restore it, period. But when you're talking about lechem, a loaf of bread was not naturally a loaf of bread. It was created by human endeavor. A person took the ingredients and kneaded the dough and put it all together and baked it. So it doesn't have any intrinsic attachment. It's an attachment that came about through human effort. Therefore, even when it's separated and it's restored through human effort, it's a good chibur. And that's why it's different from the case of the Rambam, where he talks about the esrig, that when it's something that's whole, naturally, human connecting is not going to help it. But if it's something that was started off as being connected because of human effort, then human effort made it whole, and human effort could restore it to that wholeness. It's interesting that the Alter Rebbe in the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Kuf Samach Ches, brings a dissenting view. The dissenting view is based on Eliyahu Rabbah, but the Alter Rebbe says the following. He says that if you have another piece of bread, another loaf that's whole, you shouldn't rely on this. And he says that when it comes to Lechem Mishnah, it's not considered whole through attachment, just like it's not considered whole with regard to Tumah v'Tara, with regard to purity and impurity. So in other words, the Rambam, the Alter Rebbe is saying and suggesting that we follow that opinion if we have the ability to follow it, that it shouldn't be considered attachment, even though the initial status of it was not attached because it was brought together by human endeavor.